Steve Mason and me are going to talk about transition, but it's a little different this time because Steve, you transitioned from the Marshal Service, becoming a private investigator, and we haven't talked about that on the show. We've talked about entrepreneurship or coptrepreneur. I can't even say it, like what Adam Wills talks about. But we haven't talked about somebody who went from the federal GS 1811 world to private investigator. And so I'll try and start out where I try to start out with everybody, with you. What helped you in your transition from federal agent, essentially, deputy U.S. Marshal, to private investigator? And what hurt?
I think the biggest thing that helped me was, prior to transitioning, I started thinking about, what types of things do I need to learn? What do I need to know? And one of the things I started focusing on really early on was networking. And, so I just started reaching out to other people that had left the government service and became PIs and just started picking their brain as to, how do you set up an agency? How do you get, little things like even like, how do you get licensed? How do you find clients? And, it was just kind of that classic, as 1811s, we'd go out obviously and make informants and stuff. So it was kind of almost like making informants in the business world,
Right.
and, and just picking their brains and trying to get information. And, it's definitely invaluable because, if you can stand on the shoulders of giants, you'll be able to see a lot more than if, you're on the ground. So I really think that was kind of the biggest help, was just the whole networking piece.
Well, you already investigator with the Marshal Service and inspector, I think is the term that you all use. But so you had those investigative skills. That was important. Let's talk about licensing for a second. We're in the state of Arizona. Are you required to have a private investigator license? I know you're required to have a business license, but for PIs, you're required to have a license here.
Yeah. So in Arizona, private investigators were all licensed through the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and it's kind of weird because there's two different licenses. There's what they call a qualifying party, which means that you're licensed to own a PI business, and then there's just being a private investigator license, which is through a qualifying party, and they have totally different requirements. So in my case, I'm a qualified party because I own a business. So not only do you have to qualify to become a private investigator, but then you have to meet their, however many thousands of, I think it's 6,000 or 8,000 hours of investigative experience. And you have to submit, letters from prior employers, and there's a whole application process that goes into that.
California was 2,000, 3,000 hours, something like that, of experience that they want you to have. And so there's a experience component, and there's an insurance component, right? There's all these things that you might not have known going into this. Is there anybody who helped you understand that world, or was it just through your diligence and your research in the Google machine?
It started out pretty much just with the Google machine. But, then it's funny because I hadn't really discovered LinkedIn prior to transitioning. Because in my prior position, it was discouraged. Having social media accounts was discouraged because of the job I was working in. And so they didn't want our faces out there. We were supposed to have LinkedIn accounts. So I literally, the first thing I did is I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought LinkedIn for Dummies and Facebook for Dummies.
You bought an actual book? Made out of paper?
Yes, the actual yellow book, because I had never signed into those things. I mean, obviously I knew what Facebook was from doing investigations and things, but, I had never actually had my own account. And it literally, when I say the ground up, I'm talking working out of the book, going line by line with the example of how to create an account. But, I'd come home from work every night, and I would just, for hours until I went to bed, 7 days a week, for probably 2 years straight, just literally learning everything I needed to know. And then eventually as I met people, they've really helped with the transition. Rich Robertson at R3 Investigations in Tempe was a huge mentor, from learning how to really run the actual business side of things.
Wait. But as a private investigator, that's all you do, right? You're not also a business owner. Oh, wait. Yeah, you are. Sorry. More importantly, you're a business owner first, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, this morning I got here at about 6, was working on invoices, trying to collect on invoices that weren't paid from the prior month, responding to new client emails. There's definitely a large administrative component to your job. But I think that's kind of also a little something for me that was exciting, right? Because I didn't work the administrative part of it when I was in federal law enforcement. It was just the running and gunning. So it's definitely kind of a cool piece of the pie.
One of the things that we were talking about right before we went kind of on air, if you will, was, we were talking about billing and the hourly rate. As GS, I don't know, I was at 13 when I left federal service. You were probably very similar. And you think about your hourly rate, 40, 50, 60 bucks an hour, whatever it is, and compared to what our bill rate is as consultants for me, investigator for you, and it's considerably, we won't talk about specifics, but it's considerably more than that. And so we were talking, that's something that's hard for people coming out of law enforcement to understand is what will the market bear for your services? How do you understand that? Explain to us that. How did you switch that in your brain to understand the billing and what you charge people for your services?
Sure. And that's a really hard component because when I first started the business, that was something I still didn't understand. I had tried to reach out to people to kind of feel that out, but with business competition the way it was, not a lot of people wanted to talk about what their billing was. So kind of where I started is I knew that private investigators could get appointed by the courts to cases. So I kind of looked at like what that court rate was. And I knew in my mind, whatever the court rate was, it probably was double in the real world because the courts, on court appointed cases always pay less. So I just kind of through just trial and error, I noticed that if people thought I was really cheap or they'd make comments I was cheap, then I would just start slowly bumping it up. And then, eventually I got to know more people that were more transparent with what their fees were. But one thing people don't think about is it's hard to say that hourly rate, right? When you come from government service, because you're not used to selling anything. Everyone is at GS-13 makes the same. I mean, it's just, right. There's no, there's a ladder and everybody knows where they're at in that ladder. But what you don't think about is, as part of that conversation, you got your pay, your TSP contributions, your vacation time, and all that costs the government money. And so when they figure out what does a GS-13 make, it's not just your $125,000 a year. It's that plus the cost of all those benefits. So you really have to figure that out in the private world as to what your personal value is. And I still have a hard time sometimes saying it when I get calls from law firms, but you get over it pretty quickly once you start having to make that paycheck again.
But just like in federal service, we have to work at least 40 hours a week, and of course we were both LEAP, so you're no overtime, and you probably, like me, work many hours over those 40 hours as a federal agent. But yeah. I think it's a little different as a solo practitioner for yourself. What are your hours like? What's your work day like? You putting in more than 40 hours a week, I imagine?
I generally work Monday through Saturday. I work 10 to 12 hours, more on the 12-hour side Monday through Friday, and then on Saturdays I try to limit to just 10. But the phone's always ringing, the emails are always going. My wife is always teasing me. She's like, hey, let that go till tomorrow. But at least in the PI world, you have to see yourself like you're a vendor for law firms. And at the end of the day, law firms have to get their work done. And if you're not available, they go on to the next vendor. So, I hate to use the term work-life balance because I don't even really understand what that means after all these years. But, if you're going to own a business, there's definitely not a work-life balance. But if you have a genuine enthusiasm and love in what you do, then it doesn't really feel like work. Like I'll blow through 12 hours like nobody's business. And it doesn't faze me because I really generally enjoy the space that I'm in. It's almost like it becomes just like your lifestyle, really, running a business.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Okay, last question, and then we'll cut it and we'll go to our next segment. But what hurt? What hurt you as you were making the transition? What didn't work for you?
I think not understanding where the customer base came from. I started my business at the end of 2016, and my thought, I had this thought in my head, probably like a lot of people, like, hey, you put up a nice looking website, somehow all these people start calling your phone and you have customers, right? And then,
If
the
only it was
reality
that
kicks
easy.
then the reality kicks in when you don't get emails and phone calls for weeks at a time.
That's right.
So it was kind of, I wish I had done a little bit more research as to how to market my skills, and that was something that took time. But like everything, you eventually learn as long as you stay in the game long enough. And I think that's something to kind of consider, right? If you're going to start a business, make sure you have some money set aside that you can use towards that business, because no matter what you do, there's going to be expenses, and it's going to cost, whether you're selling private investigative services or you're selling homes or whatever you do, there's always those costs. And that's it's definitely something to kind of budget in and save for, so you can ride out that learning curve.
Yeah, and I'm sure the pandemic didn't really help business, but you survived, which is great to hear.
We
And
actually
so,
made, oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
We actually made about 30% more this year in the pandemic. It's kind of weird, but the civil attorneys really turned up their work volume this year because the courts kind of threw out a lot of the deadlines for filing, so it was kind of first come first serve. So there was this big rush with attorneys to get their cases filed. And I think with a lot of people working at home, they kind of got rid of some of those distractions maybe that slowed down the process on their end, because I've noticed they were a lot more diligent in their cases. It was the phone calls increased. I think there was a sense of urgency, to make money because nobody knew what was going to happen. And, that actually ended up being really good for us.
That's great. So we'll pause there. We'll pick up with this. I want to talk more about the I world and the kinds of things that you're working on. I know you've talked a lot about that in the past. But what I say to the people who are watching on LinkedIn, make sure you put your comments and questions down below. Both Steve and I are very active on LinkedIn. We will respond to you. And let us know what you think, and let us know if you have any questions. So thanks, Steve. We'll hold it there, and we'll be back in just a sec.